From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, it's a special, very special honor and a pleasure to be able to introduce a marvelous writer who I'm fortunate to call a friend. I've described him before in the Washington Post as one of the most eloquent and probing public intellectuals in America. I'm speaking, of course, of Richard Rodriguez. You know Richard, of course, from his string of fresh, pioneering, totally original books, works that stretch the mind, widen the public conversation, and force us to consider the world anew. He is part memoirist, part national commentator, part philosopher, part cultural critic. More than anything, he is that rare individual who shows up in complicated times to sort out the complications and tell hard truths. He's been a newspaper columnist, a television commentator, an editorial writer. His great contribution to the American conversation has been an unwillingness to accept the easy, conventional wisdom about race in America. His laser-like ability to cut through the political babble and cant has led him to more than a few truths of who we Americans are and what we have been led to think. Richard displayed that agile mind most famously in his contrarian book, Hunger of Memory, in which he asked probing questions about ethnicity, assimilation, and the American tendency to patronize its minorities. Hunger of Memory produced a galvanic conversation in America. Were we infantilizing Hispanics, relegating our Black Americans to lesser status by institutionalized rhetoric and affirmative action programs? Richard began 3 decades ago, excuse me. I began this 3 days ago. A conversation that had never been engaged before. Apart from his ability to think outside the box, Richard has proven himself to be a writer with a huge heart. This was most evident in his book-length essay, Brown, in which he explained with poetic sensibility the ethnic divisions we had assumed in this country that are simply no longer true. The black and white divide has been bridged in the last generation by a new American rainbow, the Cambodian black Chicano boy in Houston, or the Vietnamese, Argentine Jewish girl in San Francisco, who are totally at ease with their Americanness. History and time are making us into an ever-evolving blend of brown. Richard's most recent book, Darling, about which he'll talk to you today, is as observant as Brown, just as provocative as Hunger of Memory. This time, Richard digs into our assumptions about religion, seeing beyond the conventional wisdom, once again, seeing beyond the facile labels we tend to put on one another. Richard describes a commonality between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim faiths. These are three beliefs, after all, in which God revealed himself to his people in the desert. The desert. What can we learn from that? That's what he's here to tell us. His book, Darling, is about nothing else or nothing less than the state of the American soul. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of America's most stimulating writers and thinkers, Richard Rodriguez.
Thank you, Marie. It's a pleasure to be here, but with some irony, I've been wandering through this mammoth space and now come into this room and wonder, where the hell have you been? For 11 months, I have been on a book tour looking for you, and you were sitting all the time in this room. I have been everywhere. I have been to the Rancho Mirage Book Festival with Joan Collins' sister. I have been to San Diego, and I went to Seattle to the wonderful Elliott Bay bookstore, one of my favorite bookstores, and there were about 10 people in the basement from my reading, and they were all elderly, about my age, and it felt, my partner Jim is a wonderful man, and he has so many friends in the world who wonder, of course, what he sees in me. And it felt very much like my memorial service, that these people were all friends of Jim's, and they sort of wondered what anyone was going to say about Richard Rodriguez since Marie wasn't there. And then you go to places where people seem to have stopped reading, college campuses, for example. I was at the Yale Co-op, and 3 people came, a mother and 2 daughters, and a postman walked by, and he stared for a few minutes, and then he delivered the mail to the main desk, and he went away. It is worth noting that this week in Florida, the largest university library without books has opened. It's an enormous space. It looks like a train station. It is a library without books. And of course, it would happen in Florida. For 11 months, I have been looking for you. I used to be the co-owner of a bookstore in San Francisco. It was the Carrot Street bookstore downtown called Tillman Place Books. It was a wonderful bookstore, a serious literary bookstore. And it had been there for a number of years when Jim and I took it over. And we died within about 10 years. But I want to tell you why we died. We were the Carrot Street bookstore, and for many years, society matrons would come to the store. They were women, curiously enough, who were sophisticated in the world, who knew the world, who knew dinner parties, who had met famous people, who had danced with the King of England, but they had not gone to college. Maybe that's why they were such good readers. They came to the bookstore, and they used the bookstore as a resource for learning about Japanese horticulture or French military history. Whatever we told them to read, they eagerly read and then wanted to talk about. They died. These women, by and large, in their 80s, when we knew them, they died. And then we began to see their daughters, who did go to college. And we would see the daughter, and she would come in, and she'd buy books very selectively. Usually, she liked British mystery novels. And then the granddaughter, who also went to college, came by, but she didn't read very much. And we would see her at Christmas, and she'd buy these absurd picture books, like Bruce Weber's photographs of naked men and their dogs or something, that Alfred Knopf was publishing. And we began to realize that something was dying, and it wasn't Jeff Bezos announcing that books were cheaper and electronic at his website. It wasn't even Barnes & Noble. It was something else. It was a certain kind of reader was dying in America, and she has not been replaced. If I tear up at that, it's not because of myself as a writer, but it is because I need you as a reader to complete the sentence. It was Ralph Waldo Emerson who said of the reader that it is the good reader who makes the good book. That a writer without a reader is incomplete, is unfinished. And most readers, I think, especially readers who even in this hall come up and say, I've read your book, and whatever they say about it, I say to myself, they have finished the book. They have finished my book. They have completed it. They have made it a book. And without them, I do not exist. My publisher would ask me to tell you, not to tell you, that I have written a book of essays. The word essay is not spoken in most publishing houses. I have written a book of essays. I am an essayist. The essay is not well regarded at a time in which the College Board no longer requires the essay being written by 18-year-olds anymore. I guess they do tweets these days. And at a time in which my own association with the NewsHour here in this city ended some years ago. The NewsHour had largely because of Jim and Robin when they were in New York. Robin, when he was in New York, I think, started the essay. It's an interesting conceit that at the end of this dulling hour of somebody from AEI arguing with the liberal opposite, that you would have this strange, solitary voice talking about something small, large, eccentric, and that with the world as large as it is in Washington, we are singly here, and we have individual lives. The decision was made to end the essays on the NewsHour, but I still remember them fondly. And one of the things I learned about the essay is that people listen to television. I didn't know that. I didn't know that having read Marshall McLuhan, but I remember going through O'Hare Airport one day. I was looking for the plane to Grand Rapids. Do you know where the plane to Grand Rapids is? And this woman started waving at me and calling me, Mr. Ramirez, she said, Mr. Ramirez. I'm also known by the name of Ray Suarez. The trouble with Mr. Ramirez is that Richard Ramirez was a mass murderer in Los Angeles. The more interesting thing about Richard Ramirez, who is still in jail, is that he receives, according to his jailers, love letters from so many women. Someday we should talk about that. Anyway, this book of essays is really a book about vampires, and it's a fun book for your children. And Maggie Smith, she has a witch's hat on, and she roams around on a broom. And Sheryl Sandberg comes in, and she leans forward or leans backwards, or this way or that way. And we all buy the book because she's a friend of that woman Huffington, who married the senator who was gay, and now runs this empire where she pays not a writer a penny, as she becomes very rich indeed on their words. I'm turning of an age now where I'll say anything, not... And if Jim were here, he would kick me under the table. But there was one show I would not do this time around, and that's an NPR show that comes on in California in the afternoon. It's a woman who interviews you from somewhere, and you stare at a wall, whether you're in New York or California. And she's never read the books that I've written, but she feels completely free to interview me. The last time she did the interview, her back had come out, or did something to her back. She was gardening. And whenever I would make a joke, she would say, "Oh, that's funny." If you go on a date with a woman who says that's funny instead of laughing, be careful. She's very good on music, but she's not so good on religion. She seems not to, her vibe is not so good, and this book is about religion, the death of religion. She's not good on Roman Catholicism, and I am, after all, a Roman Catholic. What's worse, and I'm an Irish Catholic. Most of my friends, my closest friends now, after September 11th, moved from being agnostics to being something else. A lot of them call themselves Buddhists, which sort of saves the day, or they call themselves atheists. My brother is not content with the word atheist. He calls himself an anti-theist. And all day I get these emails from him as his arthritis has gotten very bad and his hands look like claws. He writes about Christo-Republicans and some new outrage somewhere in this country. I am very much interested in what's happened to religion in the world, what is happening today on the front pages, and how we can come to an event like this, so large in its scope, and how little attention we give to religion at a time in which it is burning across the world. There is not a more urgent issue. I was at Bard College, and the dean said to me, you know, there's some students are now beginning to tease, I think that was the word she used, religiously inclined students. It's the new sort of embarrassing thing to be, too religious. And I think to myself, at a time in which most students don't know the Bible, much less the Quran, to make sense of this world without knowing what the landscape of this madness is right now in Iraq and Syria, is to be half educated or less. After September 11th, I realized two things. One is that this world could come to an end with a prayer. Those men over in New York that day were praying when they crashed those 757s into the World Trade Center. It had not occurred to me that the world could end with a prayer. The second thing that occurred to me was that I knew nothing about Islam except cartoons. I went to the Alhambra Theater as a child in Sacramento, a theater, a wondrous theater, which got torn down for a Safeway. But the Alhambra Theater was our notion, as it was in many parts of this country, of Araby, because of the success of the great Latin lover who himself was Italian and French, Valentino. They created all over this country vaguely Spanish-sounding of La Valencia and the Alhambra, these dreams of gardens and palaces. And there was this Ottoman palace in Sacramento where I saw Grace Kelly, and then she got married to a prince in Monaco. So I went to the Middle East, and there were a lot of things I learned there. One, of course, was that I learned harshly what I guess I knew intellectually, and that was the God I adore, the God I get down on my knees with Jews and Muslims to pray to, is in fact a desert God. The Abrahamic God reveals himself to Abraham, a dry old man in a desert. To non-believers, of course, this adds to the complexity of our belief. How can a God come in this lunar landscape? Why would your God come here? There is nothing here. Why would he come in nothingness? And what does that tell us? That God reveals himself in nothingness. A monk tells me outside of Bethlehem, he tells me, the desert creates warriors, he says, as we're leaving the monastery. And I think to myself, as I look at today's newspaper, the desert creates warriors. I remember an Arab friend of mine in Cairo. He said to me, "You're so surprised by this violence of the Sunni against Shia." He said, "What do you think?" He said, "We are about, in the age of Islam, we are about where Christianity was in its age, when when Catholics and Protestants killed each other. Do not be so surprised," he says. There's Steve Jobs calling already. One of the things this book is also concerned with is the secular evasion of place, our inability to live with the consequences of place. I remember I was sitting in a barber chair, so I had to watch it. Oprah Winfrey was with Bono one day, and they were between flights on their private airplanes, convincing us that we need to be more green in our lives. And I thought to myself, I wonder whether either of them have ever looked from the plane that they are flying and noticed that most of the world is brown. Dust. The fastest growing ecology in the world right now is the desert. The desert is crawling all over the world into the great cities, into the Chinese capital. Even in climates where there is green, where spring and summer is green as childhood, the fulfillment of nature is brown, autumn, and its recapitulation and resurrection comes in winter with brownness. The world's great religions always begin with this notion of mud as a source of creation. But we are, I think, under the impression that it all is a green idea, nature. In fact, in a lot of Christmas cards I get every year, the baby Jesus will be pictured in what looks like the Swiss Alps, and the Christmas trees have this little sparkle to them, and I think to myself, that wasn't it at all. That wasn't it at all. There's an essay on the newspaper, on the death of the American newspaper, and the reviewer of the Boston Globe thought, why did you put that in the book? I put it in the book because we no longer live in Peoria. We have decided as a people we no longer live in the cities we live in. When I was born in San Francisco, the fact of my being born was noted in the local newspaper. Deaths were noted, marriages. The fire across town was noted every day. Police calls were noted. And now we are not reading our local paper. I would like to argue because we don't live in those towns anymore. And the only conversation we have, thanks to CNN and MSNBC and Fox News, is this conversation about this town, about politics in this town. And I'm telling you, we are missing the 4-H convention. We are missing the Little League game. We are missing the death of the moth. When Virginia Woolf writes that wonderful essay about the death of a moth, I think to myself, there is no place in a newspaper for the death of a moth. I think sometimes that we have written American history backwards. We think to ourselves that Henry Ford invented our love for the automobile, but I think Americans invented Henry Ford. I think we had gotten desperate to move away from our in-laws in New Jersey. And we needed a way to move quickly and cheaply, and we invented Henry Ford, who gave us the Model T Ford. I think in the American suburbs, we have gotten very lonely for more than the sound of a leaf blower. And we invented Steve Jobs. And now I was in some speeches this afternoon, wandering through these halls. In the back rows, people are reading emails. The inability now for us to be alone is astonishing. Not far from Walden Pond, a woman was jogging down a road recently. I do not mean to mock her memory, but she was plugged into her private sound, not to the sounds of birds. And she was killed by a truck. The other day at 8th and California Street, a young man crossed right in front of my green Honda, paying no mind to the fact that he was moving against the light. He came this close to being killed. I blasted my little sad Honda horn. He looked over his shoulder and waved. And then he continued to the other side. It seems to me when I'm sitting on a subway in New York and everyone is like this, watching The Simpsons or checking their email for a lover that they lost long ago. I go to this animal gym in San Francisco, and these gorillas, they don't look at each other anymore. Between sets, they all look at their email. And I think, well, do you want to meet him? Does Bruce want to meet Ted? Should I introduce them to each other? Or are they communicating on some kind of tribal email? Charlie Rose, before he became the great eminence that he is now, once looked, he has a wonderful North Carolina sleepy look, and you're not quite convinced that he's really awake. Oh, I forgot my O'Hare airport story. Let me finish it. This woman who thought I was Richard Ramirez had remembered an essay that I wrote on AIDS and architecture. And that was 2 years before she was remembering this. And I realized that she had finished the essay. And she remembered how the essay worked. Do you understand what I'm saying? She remembered how A led to B led to C. That an essay is not simply an opinion. Are you for it or against it? An essay is the process of thinking. That's what essays teach us, how to respond to our experience. Charlie Rose says, do you think of yourself as a gay writer? And I said, no, I think of myself as a morose writer. And it is true. I have never quite understood this little gay flag that I'm supposed to be waving. My gayness. If I think of my friends who died in my arms with AIDS, I don't think any of us were gay. It was something else altogether. I feel rather like a character in an Edwardian novel who's survived the war, walking down Piccadilly and hearing the noise of the streets, but has left something behind. Anyway, I call this book Darling because it's not about being gay, it's about women. One of the things about my childhood that was interesting to me at a quite early age was my friendship with little girls. How many girls I knew, how I would sit with them in school and gossip and laugh, and how, after a while, how embarrassing that was, that a boy who hung around girls was a sissy. But I loved girls, and I love women now. The darling in this book is a woman who died a few years ago of cancer. It takes place in Malibu on a day in which her divorce was finalized, and we were at a restaurant and overlooking the ocean. And it begins as a discussion of that very word, darling, the insincerity of it, the gayness of it. The interior decorator saying to you, darling, I think we've done a little bit too much beige, don't you? Maybe we should do the bedroom in green, emerald green, something like that, just for a while. Or the beautician saying, you know, darling, this summer, let's do a shorter haircut, huh? You'd look so good in short hair. There are a lot of people who come through this book. Cary Grant is one of them, because I was standing in front of the Current Theater as a young boy going to see How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. And Cary Grant got out of his limousine with Diane Cannon, a woman he was about briefly to marry, and he put her in his arms and said, darling, and then got back in the car and rolled down the window. I'll see you later, darling, he says. Well, that word recurs, and part of the problem I have at this lunch at the beginning is that when I come to the lunch, I start referring to darling as darling, and she's pissed off. She wants a man to talk to. She doesn't want an interior decorator to talk to. We get beyond that. And I propose in this book that the real revolution going on right now in the world has to do with women. Has to do with a little girl getting her head shot in Pakistan on her way to school. Has to do with American girls on college campuses being raped. Has to do with peasant women in India who have been assaulted by their entire village and then left to hang. Has to do with upper middle class women in Riyadh today, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, who in protest are getting into their automobiles and driving, knowing that they will be arrested because they are not in the company of men, and will be arrested, politely treated, sent back to the police station until a man comes to drive them home. Something is going on that is so large in this world right now that I cannot imagine my liberation as a homosexual man without thinking about women and what women are doing and why it is possible, even in this time of my liberation, why it is possible for gays to be married, but women's reproductive rights are still nowhere near the public support that gay marriage has. So that's darling. That is who she is. That is why she is at the center of this book, my darling, my beloved. The last chapter of the book is a book about the three ecologies of the desert, the holy desert. The first, of course, is the mountaintop, where the communication with God takes place, where Moses ascends and then comes back to tell us. Martin Luther King Jr., on the night before he was killed in Memphis, Tennessee, told us, I have been to the mountaintop. The second ecology is the vast plain of the desert, the enormous plain, blinding, humiliating, unshaded. I call it the region of kvetch. Are we there yet? 40 years, or are we there yet? And the last is the cave, and I want to leave you with this. The cave. What desert people know is the harshness of and the blinding quality of midday sun that you can't see in the sun. that it is only when shade descends that there is time for reflection and conversation and breaking the fast, dates. That experience of darkness as being the source of illumination is important for all three major strains of these religions. God puts Moses in a cave so he will not be blinded by his passage. The Prophet Muhammad has his illumination in a cave, in the darkness. It is the happy paradox of Islam, that illumination comes to him in the dark. This is exactly opposite our civics course when we read Plato and the allegory of the cave, where people of the cave are mocked by the Greek, and we have built all these temples to Greek memory in this city to the light, because we have no respect for cultures of the darkness. Jesus was born in a cave, and he died and was resurrected in a cave. Well, at the very end of the book, there is a discussion of Mother Teresa, who was a woman I saw at San Quentin prison. She was about this tall. She was at San Quentin prison one day in her sari. And I think it was in the chapel of the prison. They had lined up about 15 cutthroats to meet her. And these guys with all their tattoos coming up over their necks were all like little schoolboys. I think in any other place she would have given them rosaries, but they probably would have used the rosaries to strangle each other. So they handed out holy cards for them. She told them the most remarkable thing. She said, if you want to see the face of God, look at the face of the prisoner standing next to you. Tattoos. A tear, a tattoo tear. Toward the end of her life, she was mocked and mocked in the pages of Vanity Fair magazine. I mean, there are a lot of places to be mocked, but Vanity Fair magazine, which is sort of one step up from People magazine. It's edited by a Canadian who used to have very Chopin-like hair. He very much wants to be English, so would somebody please give him his British citizenship? We have to hear about Harry, and we still remember the death of Diana and every other issue. Anyway, one day I opened up Vanity Fair magazine and all the perfume ads fell on the ground. And there was the great poet eminence of Washington, D.C., Christopher Hitchens, who was alternately advising us to go to war in Iraq and was telling us in that article that Mother Teresa was ugly. That what served Vanity Fair magazine to mock her looks interested me. After her death, her letters, her private journals were published against her desire by her superiors and spiritual confessors. And it turned out that for the last 40 years of her life, Mother Teresa suffered a great deal from a lack of belief, from an absence of belief, from what she said was a sense of darkness. She describes her life in one of the letters as feeling like she was living in a tunnel. And I use her in the book as an example of how it is possible to live a holy life without a sense of having God nearby at all, but rather the opposite. I dedicated the book to the Sisters of Mercy, the Irish group of nuns who educated me in Sacramento, California, who taught me this language, who taught me that teaching was a vocation, not a job, who told me that there was something holy to being a teacher, one generation passing on to the next. When she died in Calcutta one night, the electrical system in her part of the city went black. There were 2 emergency generators in the convent. One of the generators was put on so that the life support system could be continued. And then that went dark. They got out the second generator. They put it to her mouth. And that went dark. She died in the dark. She is my saint. Thank you very much. I forgot. I'm going to do this in my hotel room. I forgot to tell you about newspapers. I've written the essay on newspapers as an obituary because we don't write obituaries anymore because friends of mine die and say, I don't want any notice taken of my death. And the more interesting thing is that cemeteries are dying at the same rate that American newspapers are dying. We are no longer being buried. Gramps is in the closet next to the Christmas tree ornaments. Or I have a friend in San Francisco, she went on a boat, and the winds off the Farallon Islands are pretty severe in summertime. The family wasn't talking. There was 3 separate groups of relatives on this tugboat. And nobody was talking to anybody. And the wind came up, and the ashes came back on everybody, so it looked like a minstrel show. And when they came back under the Golden Gate Bridge, they played I Left My Heart in San Francisco. Something so large is going on in this country, the change of our burial habits, and nothing is said about it. We talk about Barack Obama and the Republicans. Nothing is being said. You understand? Men in my neighborhood started wearing shorts at the same time that women started wearing pants. So many times you'll see this woman with very, very interesting looking legs, one presumes, in slacks next to some guy who has very hairy legs. And no one remarks on it. If you go to your death without somebody saying this thing, say at least on your deathbed, Richard Rodriguez said something about minstrel show and hairy legs. I'm supposed to solicit questions after all of that. If there are no questions, we really reach a Buddhist state of inner peace. Yes.
Lined up to the door. It's great to see you, Richard. I have to admit, I didn't know you were no longer on the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour. It was my favorite ending of the News Hour. It's just great to see you here. Nobody else has a question?
There's a question here.
No, I'm sorry. If you would give us a book recommendation that we didn't see coming, that would be great. Something that we might not have picked up somewhere else.
Well, you know, I'm always looking for books that are written about this world, but written as though a novelist has written them, or a poet has written them. If you could give me a book about the Paris subway, the Paris sewer system, that's really written, I'd like to read that book. I remember as a college student, I read it to a biography of George Wallace, Governor George Wallace. Remember George? Written by Marshall Freyday. Some of you may know Marshall Freyday. He's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful writer. And I started reading that book and think to myself, this is a Faulknerian novel. This doesn't read like a biography that I'm used to. The task for writers right now, it seems to me, at a time in which we have so few possibilities of being published and read, is to take the world, to write the world. There is so much happening around us, and no one is writing it. I mean no disrespect for the photographer who was beheaded in the Middle East last week, but it seems to me that we need writers to tell us about the madness that is going on around us. George Orwell talks about a man being hanged. We have nobody who can tell us because we think we see it on YouTube. We don't see it on YouTube. We know nothing of the crowd or the noise or the stench or what the head looks as it rolls on the ground. We don't have writers who are writing in this world, and whether it's hairy legs or that head, it seems to me that there has never been a time where we need writers more. But I would start with Marcia Freyday's biography of George Wallace. It's probably out of print, but boy, what a book it is.
Thank you.
Well, Donna Tartt is from my home state and Faulkner's. So I just wanted to ask you if you have any comment at all about the Supreme Court's decision regarding Hobby Lobby.
No, give me another one. You know when your eyesight begins to fail and there's this code on the computer, reproduce that code and you can't read what the thing is until you press the button. Give me another one.
All right. How do you think it is that with us having the huge amount of poverty, like we're living on slave labor all the time, that is almost never discussed in the newspapers or by the politicians. We talk about
That's good.
middle class.
That's good. No, that's good. There are a lot of things that aren't discussed, may I just say. And one of the things that's not, one of the things that's not discussed is just the character of our lives. The fact is that, that I remember reading in this little footnote in a history of race relations in South Carolina. Did I hear South Carolina? This woman, the slave, being married to her slave owner, and then he died and she inherited their slaves. And it was just this little footnote. I thought, well, where did that go? What is that? What is the history of our lives that we have to line up? We line up for our DNA because we don't even know who we are. We don't even know what our ancestry is because no one tells us that many of you are related to American Indians and slaves. And no grandmother has ever told you. And that there was lovemaking from the very beginning. The day that the Indians met the Spaniards coming off of those boats, that something begins, distance, plague, separation. But beginning already is this flirtation with otherness. And in the middle of our lives, at a time of so much hatred in the world, I'm struck with how much love there is in the world, how people are just falling in love all over the place. And it's not like Rwanda, where one day, the tribes separate again after couples being together. That's always possible. But what is also possible is that enemies fall in love with each other. And that the churches can't stop it, that society can't make it illegal, but people are falling in love all over the place, and it is worth remarking. It is one of those great themes that no one talks about in America, and that is how much we love each other. Yes.
Thank you. Actually, one comment. I remember your essays very well on the NewsHour, and actually to this day, I remember the essay you did for the 500th anniversary of Columbus.
Yes.
So your pieces definitely make an impact on us.
Thank you.
My question is for you as a writer and your evolution as a writer. Would you say most of your evolution or your influences come from an external sense, or does it come from internal introspection and work?
It may have come from historical factors, the fact that I was unattractive to myself as a boy, the fact that I was a queer little boy, and I suspected as much. The fact that Sacramento, California had long summers, that it slowed down, and that it was easy to spend the summer reading, One of the press releases of my appearance here had it that I'm a Catholic, but a gay man in a church that rejects me and so forth. And one of the things I really want to say is that it didn't feel like that. It never felt like that. The church was so complicated and rich and loving, and as an altar boy, I would go to funerals, and I was one of the candle holders at funerals, and I knew the rhythms of grief, and that really deepens you. And I carried caskets to the gaping hole, and then I went back to the arithmetic class at Sacred Heart School. It was that seamless. On junior prom night at Christian Brothers High School, I didn't go. I would have taken you if I'd known you. I'd given you a carnation corsage, and we would have danced. But I didn't know you, and so I didn't go. But Malcolm X was in town, and I went. And I told my mother I was going to a movie, and sometimes you can use loneliness for very creative purposes. You can make it a very interesting companion. Turn off that machine. Turn off whatever boys are doing upstairs with their monsters and their wars. Turn it off and become brave. Take care of somebody. But I remember I walked into the auditorium like this, and there were these two guys at the door. One of them looked like Sonny Liston. The other one looked like Mike Tyson in black suits. And I looked in the room, and everyone was African American. They were almost all men. And I know they hesitated as they saw me on the steps, and they let me in. Their bravery, as much as my chance, their bravery to let this brown boy in was really quite remarkable. And the freedom I had was that I couldn't tell anybody afterwards. Everybody was talking about the dates they had, how miserable they were, and and all of that. So who would I say? I went to go see Malcolm last night, you know. There was no one to tell. I've told you today. It's taken me 40 years to tell you this. But that's the nature of loneliness, that you can turn it into a literary manifestation. You understand? That the reason, you know, there was a lot of debate about my first book, Hunger Memory, and many Mexican Americans still, if you look on Amazon, see what they say about it. I barf on that book, they'll say. And somebody says, you know, you're supposed to be a role model to other Mexican Americans. I think writers are never role models. I mean, what kind of language is that, role models? And so, you know, the nuns were not role models. They were moral examples about how you behave. A role model, I never became a nun. I never put a rock in my sweater like Virginia Woolf and walked into a lake. But she was an example of a certain bravery and the linguistic freedom to walk through the darkness. You understand? We live in a world that has trivialized everything and turned it into something, you know, gay, when it is really, really complicated, our lives. And my mother now is criticized, I've seen in print, because she had a gay son. I think to myself, you know, my pride is that I was the son of a very strong Mexican woman. And that there are people who will use that against my mother, her strength, as being the meaning of my homosexuality. My strong mother gave birth to the writer in me, is the way I put it. One last question.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm wondering if you could offer some thoughts or commentary on what's going on in the border right
now. I've written a book which nobody knows called Days of Obligation, which Octavio Paz said when he read it in Mexico. His colleague, whom I can't remember at this moment, at Vuelta magazine said, Octavio came in with your book, 3 copies of it. He said, somebody in America has written a book about Mexico. It's called Days of Obligation. He was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, and then the honchos came in. The referees gave it the Pulitzer Prize. The honchos, these guys who go from place to place in Washington in these boardrooms, they came by and they said, we have 2 presidential biographies. What else would we want to read in America but a presidential biography? So they gave Lincoln to biography that year, and then they gave Thomas Jefferson, I don't know who it was. And so Days of Obligation was sort of like, it came in second in the World Series. It didn't win. But that book is really about the nature of Mexico, the tragic nature of Mexico, how different it is to the comic possibility of America. One of the things about America now, as we've grown addicted to chemicals of every sort because we can't go to sleep at night, and because our children can't stand their reality without plugging or snorting, is that we have destabilized much of the world with our addictions at the very same time that people want to come for our optimism. So you have all of these people coming for the comic possibility of America to become somebody new in America at the very time when Americans have grown frustrated, depressed, neurotic about not achieving the pursuit of happiness. And there is this clash of comedy and tragedy at that border. It is epic. And we are witnesses to something. We are watching Huck Finn at the border. We used to read books in the 19th century about boys who left home, and now we have the spectacle, and we don't know what to do with the boy who left home. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.